Hi folks, we are going to learn how to make your colors pop in Photoshop. Hi folks, Kristy from Sharkpixel here, and in today's video we're going to learn how to make colors pop in Photoshop. We're going to take this image and turn it into this, and this one into this, and finally we'll take this photo and turn it into this. You can download the files you need to follow along for this tutorial for free at the link below. Just put in your email, download the files, and open them so you can do the steps with me. Now that you have the images downloaded, let's start with the first PSD. And we're going to bring it into our Photoshop window. And the first thing that I want to do with this shot, you can see here that we do have the background folder. It's empty right now in the subject folder. So what I've done is created those masks for you. This is not a tutorial on masking, and that's the reason why I want to spend all of my time on color adjustment tools for today. So the first thing I want to do is I would like to create a curves adjustment layer. So I'm going to come to my adjustments panel, and I'm going to come in to the curves adjustment inside the single adjustments section. If you don't have your adjustments open, you can always go to Window, and you can choose adjustments. You can see that my window is visible because it has a check mark next to it. Okay, so we're going to come in and we're just going to click our curves adjustment. And now I want to make sure that this curves adjustment layer is not in any of my groups. So right now, because it's indented like that, you can see that it's in the subject group. I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to drag it until it sits not within the folder, so there's not a blue box around the folder, but instead a blue line, and that's where I'm going to drop it because I want this to be my first change, and this is going to be a global change, which means that this is going to be an effect that gets applied to not only the background, but also the subject. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to take my black point and I'm going to move this over just a touch to about a 7. And now at this point, I would like to maybe just pop out some of these skin tones just a little bit more. To do that, I'm going to activate within this curves adjustment, I'm going to activate this little finger tool, and then I'm going to click down here, and I'm just going to kind of bring up those colors to make them pop just a little bit more. All right, so you can see that what that does is it takes a reading as I hover this eyedropper over the different colors of the image. If you take a look at what's going on in this little window, you can see that as I hover over from the lighter values to going to the darker values, you see how it changes the location? That's because what's going on here is this is every single pixel in your image, and that pixel is given a brightness darkness value. And then the brightness darkness values that are the same are going to be stacked on top of one another. And that's going to show you how this histogram works. So you can see here we have a lot of the darker pixels, the almost black pixels. And then as we get into the lighter values, we have less and less of those lighter values in the image. So I'm not talking about color, I'm talking brightness, darkness value at the moment. So that's just my first overall step. I'm just going to brighten up just a touch of the brighter values in the image, and then I'm going to add just a little bit of darkening, and immediately that makes our subject pop just a little bit, right? So our next step is going to be to start working inside these folders. So we've got our folder for our background. You can see that here. I've already made the mask for you, and you can see that the background area is in white and the subject area is in black. That means that any adjustment layers that we put inside this folder are only going to be visible on the background and not on the person, and vice versa for our subject. Okay, so this is why it's important to download the demo file to follow along with me. So whenever we're talking about color and color theory, sometimes it's important to think about complementary colors or the kind of color theory techniques that we are all familiar with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring out my window where I have gone to color.adobe.com, and then I've chosen the complementary section within the create area. Okay. And so this is a little bit clunky, so I will kind of just put that out there. We don't need this many swatches for this example. What I'm going to try and do for you is I'm going to try and show you that this can be a helpful tool, right? So for some reason, it's a little clunky right now. I don't know why it keeps doing this, but we're going to go to complementary colors, okay? We're going to go to complementary colors, and then what I'd like you to do is activate this eyedropper, and then I want you to bring that eyedropper over to your image, okay? And so you can click anywhere on this image, and it's going to give you a color, all right? Now, let me click back and eyedrop on the hair color again, because this is the color that I'm looking for. And I'm going to change from custom to complementary. I don't know why it keeps changing me back to custom, but I sampled the hair color from her, and what I'm looking for is the complementary color to her brightest, most saturated color, and that's her hair. So I can see that the background, if I want it to be a complementary color for this image, the background needs to be like a tealish dark color. Now we can come in here and to change color, and we can scroll down, and if we want, we can come in here and darken that color if we need to. But I think you guys get the gist. So this burnt orange, or this brownish reddish color, is going to be best suited as a complementary color for a teal background. So that's kind of what we are going with so far, but let's just really augment and exaggerate this. So it's a very helpful tool. So the first thing I'm going to do within this background folder is create a selective color adjustment layer. And that's this icon right up here. And now you can see that this is indented into the folder, so that's what I want. If you want to check and make sure that it is indeed in the folder that you're working with, just go ahead and take that disclosure arrow and bring it up and down, and you'll see that that adjustment layer does disappear inside. So we know that it's in the right spot. Let's click on that selective color adjustment layer, and now we're going to play around with the colors of our background. So I would, if I had to guess, I would say that the colors of our background are mostly green, and they might fall into the cyans a little bit. So I'll go ahead and adjust those. So from my colors drop-down menu within my selective color adjustment layer, I'm going to choose greens. And now I'm going to make a couple changes. So each one of these sliders means that you are either going to add this color. Okay, so we got our cyan slider. So we have cyan, where we could add cyan to the greens, or we could remove cyan from the greens, okay? Now, removing cyan from the greens is going to just add cyan's complementary color, which is red. So that's how all of these work. So for my green colors in my image, this is a really, really great tool. Once you guys grasp how this works, this is a really great tool to adjust color without having to mask anything. So for my greens, I could add green because green is the complementary color of magenta, or I could add magenta to the greens, and that's going to kind of neutralize that green color. I'd like to show you an example that's just a little bit more visible. And to do that, we're going to take this selective color layer, and just for a moment, we are going to click and drag it and move it and drop it onto the top of our layer stack so that all of the image is being affected by the changes that we're making. Because I need to explain this to you first. And I feel like we're having a problem because the changes that I'm making are so minute. So with the reds selected inside my colors, you can see that we have the option to add cyan to the reds or add red to the reds by pulling all the way to the left. So when you add cyan to its complementary color of red, you can see how it almost desaturates or neutralizes that red. But if we pull this add cyan slider all the way down to 0%, we are adding red to our reds, which makes that red hair pop. Okay, so I'll double click cyan to bring it back. Same with magenta and green. If I add magenta to the red colors in my image, you can see how everything turns a little bit more pink. If I add green to the reds in my image, you can see how everything definitely turns a lot more like a greenish yellow. And also with the yellows, if I add yellow to my reds, I can do that by sliding the yellows all the way up. And if I subtract yellow from my reds, aka adding blue to my reds, you can see how I get a little bit of a purplish color coming through. All right, so that's just a little bit about selective color and how it works. You also not only have the colors, but you have whites, neutrals, and blacks, which you could use in conjunction with this. But we're going to take this selective color layer and we're going to drag it and drop it back into our background folder, because now I want to make some adjustments for just the trees. Within our green drop-down menu right here, we have our selective color active. I'm going to add 100% cyan to my leaves. I'm going to add just about +9 magenta to my leaves. And then for the yellows, I'm going to pull almost half of the yellows out of the leaves because I'm trying to shift the background leaves to be more tealish in color. Remember our complementary colors, right? Teal. This is what I'm kind of going for. This is what I want to bring out. So some of the leaves are going to fall within the green spectrum. Some of them are going to fall within the cyan spectrum. So I'm going to change over into my colors area from greens to cyans. And now I'm going to make some adjustments on the cyans. Now I'm not going to go as far now, so I'm adding just a little bit of cyan to my cyans. For my magentas, I'm going to add a lot to +38, yep. And then for my yellows, I'm going to add just a touch, so just +3, which is basically nothing. Okay, so clicking on and off of the background, I want you guys to see the color shift. More warm, those leaves are more warm, and now they're more aligned with the complementary color of her hair, right? And of her coloring. So that is what I'm looking for. The next thing that I want to do to adjust and make my subject pop out a little bit more is going to be to add a hue saturation adjustment layer within my background folder. And this is pretty simple. We're just going to take the hue, the overall hue of all of our colors, and shift it just a little bit. So it's about a -8 for our hue slider. For our saturation slider, I definitely want to bring this down because I do not want the green colors of the trees in the background to be the subject of this photo. I want this to be all about the person. And then again, I'm just going to add -3 lightness to this background. So if I go on and off of the background, you can see how I was able to pull back that background, make it feel like it's a little bit more separated from our subject. Now we get to move on to the fun things that we are going to do for our subject. The first thing I want to do for her is hit the hue saturation adjustment layer and just do an overall increased saturation on the subject. But remember that we do need to make sure that this new hue saturation adjustment layer that we created is indeed nested within our subject folder where we already have the mask set. Now, if for any reason it's on the outside, we've done that before. You click and drag until there's a blue box over the folder, and then you just drop it in there, and then that's how you know that your hue saturation adjustment layer is within the folder. Okay, so let's click on that hue saturation and let's rename this Add Sat to Model. Then we'll come to our Properties menu and we're going to increase the saturation to just about 6. The next thing that I want to do is within this subject folder, I'd like to access the Vibrance adjustment layer. And now I'm going to increase the vibrance of her as well. And that's really, really an easy way to make her pop. Okay? So just increasing the vibrance to 30%. I want to just show you quickly the difference between saturation and vibrance. Saturation, if I pull it all the way up, you are going to see an overly saturated skin tone. Now I'm going to double click saturation. And now if I take the vibrance all the way up, you can see that we do not get that same effect on her skin tone because it's going to increase the saturation of all colors other than your skin tones, okay? And so for this, we're just going to hit a +30 for our vibrance slider. Our saturation slider is at 0, and then we're ready to move on. Now it's time to get advanced. What I would like to do now is I would like to create a color grading effect over her skin tone because her skin to me feels quite dead and desaturated, and I don't really like the way that it looks. So in order to do that, I want to do that within the subject folder, right? Because it is only affecting the subject. So for that, let's click on our background layer just for a moment, and we're going to go to select, and then we're going to choose color range, and then we're going to choose sampled colors from inside this color range box. Now I want to make sure that my little regular eyedropper tool is active, and then I'm going to come over and I'm going to click once on her skin where I can see it. If for any reason your image looks different than this, you might want to change your selection preview, and that can be done in here. So you can have none, you can have grayscale, you can have black matte, white matte, or quick mask. Okay, those are your different options. So let's just do black matte because that's what I was on. So I'm going to click once on the brightest skin tones, and then what I'd like to do is add and expand this selection. I'm going to turn this into a selection. So in order to add or subtract from this selection, I can use the eyedropper tool as well, but I want to change it over from the regular first sample point to the add additional colors to this selection, or you can use the subtract if you're trying to remove specific colors. So I've got the add, and I'm going to click a couple more times around on her skin tone to make sure that I select everything that I have here of her skin tones, okay? I am going to go a little bit farther than I should in selecting these because I do want to make sure that I get the shadows of her skin as well. So this is a pretty good masking starting place, I feel like. So we do have some of the hair selected, but that's okay. I'm going to go ahead and press OK here. And then what I'm going to do is with this selection, I am going to hit the gradient map adjustment layer. That you can find over here in our adjustments window. It's this guy right there. So that's going to bring up our gradient map. Now we have to do a few things first. We've got to relocate this into our subject folder. So we can click and drag gradient map and drop it at the top of our layer stack within our subject folder. And now we're going to call this skin color. And let's hold down Option or Alt and click on the layer mask icon. I'm going to do that. Now remember, because this mask is living within this mask, there's no reason for me to be concerned about all of this stuff on the outside because the mask of the group that it's in is black in that area. But I do need to come in here and get rid of some of this hair. So I'll do that by hitting my B on my keyboard for my brush tool. I will make sure that I'm painting with black. And I'm going to make a nice soft brush, and I'm just going to paint out the area where this mask picked up some of her hair, because I don't want these changes to be applied to her hair. Her hair is already awesome as it is, and it does not need any added colorization, in my opinion. I'm going to also come in here. I'm going to paint out her teeth and her lips, and I'm going to hit the X key to paint with white, and I'm just going to fill in a couple of those areas there. Okay, so this mask is almost ready for public consumption, but the last thing that I want to do is I want to just give it a little bit of a feather to make sure that I don't see any bad lines or anything like that within this mask. So for that to happen, with my skin color adjustment layer for my gradient map selected, I'm going to come up into the properties section. But I do want to make sure that my mask is what's clicked. Over here within the properties section, you have your adjustments for the actual layer and the mask adjustments. Okay, so we'll do that, and then we're going to pull up the feather for this mask just a bit. And now we can hold down Option or Alt again and click on the skin color mask icon in the layers palette. And now you can see what has happened so far. So if I click on the icon itself, you can see that these colors up here, black to white, were added to the skin color area where our mask is white. So we definitely don't want to make the skin look like that. Instead, what I would like to do is add some colors that are going to complement the skin tone. I like to do this in a very trial and error way. And so what I want to do before I change around with these colors up here is I would like to change the blend mode of this skin color layer to soft light. So with this layer active, I am going to go ahead and come into my layer blend modes, and I'm going to choose soft light from my menu. And now I'm going to click on the gradient editor bar right here in the properties window. So for this, I think that we can just kind of play around with the masks or with the gradients that they already have. So I'm going to go into my oranges, and I'm just going to click the different orange gradients that are at our disposal for this. And you can see how each one, if we look over here, is applying a certain color to the darker areas and a certain color to the lighter areas. And as I click on each different one of these, it's blending nicely with the underlying skin tone. It might be too high. Yes, it's definitely too extreme, but it's blending nicely, and that's because we did the soft light blend mode for this layer. So I'm thinking that orange 07 looks nice. We have a nice beige to a nice pink. So let's go ahead and press OK now that we've picked that gradient map. And if I go on and off of the skin tone before and after, you can see what a significant change that makes in the underlying skin tone that we were working on. So let's go ahead and take this visibility. We don't want it to be too extreme, right? And I'm also, in our next step, we're going to make a custom gradient, which is going to go over the entire subject. So I also don't want to make this too extreme either. So I'm going to pull down the opacity of this colorize effect on the skin tone. And I think that that looks pretty good in bringing back some of those original skin tones that I would like to see. The next thing that I want to do is we're going to create a adjustment gradient that is going to be on the entire subject. So we'll go up to our gradient map adjustment tool again, and we're going to click on that as it is. And again, before we make any changes, you can see how we can still see the background, and the background is still in color because all of these layers in here are only visible where our subject mask is white. And we're doing that because we are dragging and dropping and making sure that all of these layers live within our subject mask. All right, so now that we have that, we can come back here. We're going to change the blend mode of this again from normal to soft light. And we're going to change the name of this layer from gradient map 1 to overall subject adjust. Okay, that looks good. And now we'll come back up to our gradient editor bar. This time, instead of going into our preset section and just playing around with the gradients that come by default with Photoshop, what we're going to do instead is we're going to create a custom gradient. Now, I know that I would like the shadow colors of our subject to tie in with the teal, the dark teal of the background. So in order to do that, I'm going to click on this color swatch right here, and I'm going to then click on the color area that we see right here, that little color swatch box. And I'm going to try and match this darkish tealish color that we see in the background. Okay? Because I do want her to tie in. I want her to be complementary to the background, but there's got to be a little bit of a color that does actually make this look like they were shot together, right? Because if all of the colors of the subject were completely different than the background, it would make this image look just slightly too fake. All right, so that's a happy color for my darkest values. And as the values get brighter in my image, as the pixel values get brighter on my subject, the color that's currently being added is white. So the next color that I want to add is for not necessarily the darkest pixels in my image, but almost the darkest pixels in my image. So I'm going to click right here, and that's going to create another swatch box. Now I'll come down to the color and I'll click on the color swatch box here, and I want to add a really honey brown color. Now these values here are going to be probably the values of where her darker skin is and where her hair falls into. So let's just keep that in mind as we are trying to pick out the best color here. I don't want it to be too red. I want it to be like a bronzy medium brown. All right, I'm happy with that. Let me pull this out so we get a little bit more blend. Okay, at this point, what I want to do is I would like to add another color here for our highlights. So I'm going to click here, just like I did before. We're going to click on our color swatch box again, and we're going to go for one of those skin tones, one of those natural skin tones that we were playing around with earlier. So something in this vicinity, like a light pink. And so what I want to kind of show you is that don't look at the highlight areas at the moment, because those are not being affected yet. What's happening is I'm adjusting this color to like the medium colors, like right here, like right there in her skin. Okay, so that's kind of where this color is being applied to. And then the last color that's going to affect all of my brightest tones on my subject, we'll click on that swatch box, which should be already there for you. Click into our color area, and then I'm going to add a warmer brownish color. More close to a brownish maroonish color, but still with some pink. So I want to show you guys something. I want you guys to pay attention to the brightest colors of her skin tone when I do this. So remember that this color right here is being applied to the brightest values of our subject, right? So if I go ahead and change this to, let's say, a pink or a blue, can you see how that color is shining through on those areas? But if I change the brightness value of the color that I am adding to the brightest areas of the skin, did you see how it darkens those areas there? So you can easily add contrast or remove contrast just by adding a brighter or darker color to a certain location in your image. So just keep that in mind when you guys are working with this tool, because it is really powerful. It's really cool. I love using it and showing people how it works, because I really feel like it is a great, great tool. All right, so I feel like that looks good. Overall, this looks too extreme, right? But what we're going to do is we're going to back off on these colors a little bit, and that's going to allow us to get a more softer look to this entire image. So let's go ahead and press OK on this overall subject, adjust, and now we're going to pull back the overall gradient map on my subject just a little bit more. So here's our before
and our after, our before and our after. It still looks too strong for me. I'm going to pull it back just a little bit more. There's our before and our after, our before and our after. Okay, so if I look at the entire image before and our entire image after, you can see a big difference on what we were able to achieve. If I wanted to come back into here and tone down these highlights just a scotch more, I can do that, double clicking the icon of my overall subject adjust gradient map. And then I'm going to click on the gradient bar again. And here we have our gradient bar that we created. I'm going to darken this color now. Remember, because we took the opacity of this layer from 100% down to 43%. So while I liked the darkening of the hot spots initially when this adjustment was all the way visible, now that we've throttled it back to make it blend a little bit more with the photograph, I think that this needs to go darker and more extreme. So I'm going to click on this little icon right there, that color stop, click here in the box again, and I'm just going to darken it a little bit more to darken those areas. Remember, all the way bright, all the way dark. Can you guys see it in here in her face? All the way bright, all the way dark. So we're darkening that by adding just a more extreme color to our brightest values of our image. Okay, so our before and our after of just that gradient map, and then all of the subject work that we did, and all of the background work that we did. Okay, and again, the overall before and after is right there. All right, so now we're going to move on to our next image. So I just wanted to remind you guys what our before looks like for this image and our after, our before and our after. So this is what we are going to create today. So I'm going to go back to the assets that I downloaded, and I am going to select this image and drag and drop that I downloaded as an asset into Photoshop. And you'll see here that we do indeed have two folders that have different masks in order for us to make separate adjustments to the subject and the background. The first thing that I'm going to do is just a general curves adjustment to fix this black point. So we'll do that by coming up to our single adjustment section, and we're going to choose curves. And this time I am going to pull this little arrow right here, and I'm going to pull that in until I get to a value of, let's say, right when those black points start to show on my histogram. You can see right there is where the values in my image, the brightness or darkness values in my image start. They don't actually start at black, so I want to bring my black clipping point up to make this more contrasty so that where the darkest pixels are, they are actually hitting the blackest part. And now I'm going to do the same for my white point. I'm going to click and drag inwards to just create a little bit more overall contrast. There we go. And just as a reminder, I want to make sure that this overall contrast curves adjustment layer is not nested within one of the folders, because if it is, then we're going to have a result like this, where the contrast is only applied to the subject and not to the background. So in order to do that, we're going to make sure that we click and drag out of the folder and just drop it right there so that it is visible through the entire image. All right, so I'm going to rename this overall contrast. And now we're going to move on to the changes that we want to make to the subject. So remember, I did make these masks already for you, and that's why it's important to download the source files so that we can follow along and it can be a seamless process. But one thing that I did want to kind of point out is just a really quick masking tip. One of my favorite masking tips that I really love to use. So you can see here we've got some inconsistencies where the mask is, and I hit the backslash button to go into quick mask mode for this. All right, so I am on the subject changes mask, and I have hit the backslash button to go into quick mask mode. Now, two of my favorite tools to use while I am working on masks is actually the smudge tool and the blur tool. So those can be found in here, the blur tool, the sharpen tool, and the smudge tool. So I'm going to grab the smudge tool, and I'm going to come over, make my brush a little smaller, and I'm just going to actually smudge this mask out. So if I hold down Option or Alt and click on the mask icon really quickly, and I do that again, you can see how within Photoshop, without using the brush tool, I can come in and actually make changes to the mask just by using the smudge tool. And the same is true for the blur tool here. Okay, blur tool, I'm just going to click and drag along a sharp area of the mask, and you'll see that it starts to blend and blur out. Let me see if I can find a sharper area right here. Okay, blending and blurring out that mask. Okay, so that definitely, the smudge tool is one of my favorite tools when it comes to adjusting masks. So yeah, so keep that in mind. That is definitely a winner. All right, so with this image, I think I'm going to just bring in this black point just a touch more to make sure that it's really contrasty. All right, so now we're going to move on to the subject. So for this, we're going to start with just a regular vibrance adjustment layer. So we'll go up to our single adjustments. We're going to choose the vibrance adjustment layer, and we'll come in here and click on the icon of the layer, not the mask, and then we're just going to jump up and bump up that vibrance to about 57. So really make those colors pop. The next thing that I want to do is work on some curves adjustment within my subject only. So I'm going to click on the subject changes, and then I'm going to come up to my single adjustments in my adjustments window, and I'm going to choose curves again. This time I'm going to raise the shadows just a little bit so that they are a little bit brighter. So maybe around 58, something like that. And then I'm going to click on the line again near the highlights, and I'm going to bring them down, and then maybe bring over this black point just a touch to really make her have just a little bit more contrast and really pop out from the background, but still keeping that black point realistic, right? All right, so that looks good for the curves. Now we're going to go and we are going to add just a regular adjustment layer. But here's the thing. We're not going to make any changes to this adjustment layer. All we are going to do is change the blend mode. All right, so for this, we're going to go into our single adjustment layers. We're going to just choose any adjustment layer. For me, I always stick to hue saturation. And then what we're going to do is come into our layers menu. With that hue saturation adjustment layer selected, and we're going to change the blend mode from normal to overlay. And so what that does is it is a blend of two different blend modes. So any pixels that are brighter than 50% gray are going to be lightened. Any pixels that are darker than 50% gray are going to be darkened. That's how the overlay blend mode works. It is a blend of screen blend mode and multiply blend mode. So now what I'm going to do is just way pull back the opacity of that added contrast using the overlay method. So 17, 20, somewhere around 20 to 17%. I think that that looks good. So here's the work that we've done so far on our subject, just some pop. It's slight, but I want it to be slight at this point. So with our subject changes, we're going to click onto another adjustment layer, and we're going to do selective color. Now, one of the reasons why I adore the selective color adjustment layer for popping color and things like that is because it allows you to decontaminate colors. So you can see here that she is surrounded by these green leaves, for example. Now, when light, the way that light works is that it's going to bounce onto the surrounding areas and then it's going to bounce back onto your subject. But when it bounces onto the green leaves, it's going to pick up a bit of that color. And so that's one of the reasons why selective color is such a cool way to really make your colors pop. So within our selective color adjustment layer, we should start on our reds. And for the reds, I'm going to remove some of the cyan from the reds. So I'm going to bring the cyan slider down to -57. -55 is fine. For the magentas, I'm going to remove just a touch of magenta. For our yellow slider, remove a little bit of yellow. And then for our black slider, I'm going to remove just a little bit of black, which is going to really take some of that oversaturatedness out of the subject. So here's our before and our after. You can see how we're brightening her up, and we're just kind of neutralizing that color and making it a little bit softer. I think I'm going to pull a little bit more magenta out. So now that we've done our reds, let's go to our yellows. We've got our yellows drop down. For the yellows, I'm going to subtract about half of the cyan from the yellows. So -44. For the magentas, I'm going to subtract about -25 of the magentas from the yellows. And we are going to subtract -14 of yellow from our yellows. I know that it's kind of a little bit crazy. And then with our blacks, we're going to go to -11. So here's our before and our after. Before and our after. She's brightened up. She's less crunchy. We have more values in those shadow areas. I think that this is definitely a win. Now let's go ahead into our background section. We're going to make some changes there. But before and after for our subject looks pretty good, right? We were able to really make her pop out. So now for our background section, what I'd like to do is I would like to start with a hue saturation adjustment layer. And, you know, we turned her a little bit more warm and brightened her up just a touch. So what I'd like to do with the background is darken it slightly. I'd like to make it a touch less saturated and just work with the colors that I have to make them all blend just a little bit more. So with our hue saturation adjustment layer, I'm actually going to switch over to the greens for that. And then right down here in this area that is defining your green values in your hue, I'm going to make this a lot bigger. I want it to include all of the greens that I can. And now we can go in and we can actually just play around with the color of the greens if we wanted to, and really make adjustments with that. So I can go ahead and just add a touch more blue to those leaves in the back. And we can either decrease the saturation of the leaves or we can increase the saturation. So let's slightly increase it, but then at the same time, I'm going to bring down the brightness of those greens. Okay, so here's our before and our after, our before and our after. And let's just do a little bit more of that, bumping up that color so that it's a little bit more saturated, and then just darkening those green colors as well. All right, so before and after, before and after. We have changed the hue of the leaves, but I do want to keep them kind of on the warm side for some reason, because I just feel like it works with this overall image. The only thing that is kind of bothering me just a touch is the blue jeans from our model, because I feel like they are pulling my eye. And there's a couple reasons why different things can pull your eye away from the overall image. One is brightness, one is contrast, one is saturation, and one is sharpness. Okay, so for this, I think it's the saturation of this blue, and it's just this only highly saturated blue item in the entire image, these jeans right down here. So what I'd like to do is come back into my subject changes. I'm going to open this back up. I'm going to go to my selective color for my subject, not for my background. I'm going to come in and I'm going to choose the cyans from this drop-down menu. And I'm just going to play around. I'm going to polarize these. adding a bunch of cyan, removing a bunch of cyan from the cyans, okay? Adding a bunch of magenta to the cyans, removing a bunch of magenta from the cyans. So as soon as I kind of get rid of the blue undertone, again, the same with yellow, adding yellow, subtracting yellow. As soon as I subtract yellow from those blues and that blue pops out, it's the only thing I see anymore. I hope you guys are in agreement with me. So I'm going to try and blend in those cyan colors to match a little bit more with the background greens that we have in the leaves in the back. All right, so I've done that just a little bit. And then with our black slider, we can either increase black in the cyans or we can decrease black in the cyans. So let's just increase them just a little bit, and that's going to kind of pop. It's going to fade those jeans back so that I see her more and I don't see those jeans. So right now, with what we've adjusted, I quite like what we were able to achieve because I think that it's going to be a much better effect. So before and after, before and after. I think I could go a little bit higher with our hue saturation that's just set to overlay at 20%. So let's rename this hue saturation. So this is contrast overlay. And this is subject color select. Curves, this was just overall brighten. So overall fill shadows. And bright vibrance is pretty self-explanatory, right? All right, so we've got all of these different adjustments in here on our subject, and that is all housed within the subject changes. The next thing that I want to do is maybe just darken the leaves of the background just a touch. So for that, we're going to go into our background changes folder, and we are going to add a brightness and contrast adjustment layer. We're going to take some of the contrast down, pulling the contrast all the way down, and we're going to pull the brightness all the way down. But I do not want this to be visible on the yellow flowers. I only want this to be visible on the green leaves. So in order to make that adjustment, we're going to click back on our background layer. We're going to come into Select. We're going to choose Color Range. And we're going to choose Yellows. And then we're going to press OK. Now, you're not going to see a selection of all of the yellow colors, but that's perfectly all right at this point. We're going to click back on our brightness contrast layer, and we're going to hit Command or Control I to invert those selected areas of that mask. Now we can hit Command or Control D to deselect the selection that we had. And then if I hold down Option or Alt and I click on this mask icon, it's visible where we are going to see the darkening effect from our brightness and contrast decrease and where we aren't. But these darker shades of this mask are not dark enough to remove the darkening effect completely from these flowers. So this is what I call polarizing a mask. With this mask up, remember, you activate the mask by holding down Option or Alt and clicking on the layer mask icon. Now I'm going to hit Command or Control L to bring up my levels, and I'm just going to create a bunch of contrast on this mask, not on the actual layer itself. So I do not want this darkening and decreased contrast effect to be visible on the flowers, right? So I am going to pull all of this up as much as I can, and I'm going to try and find a sweet spot here. Remember, none of this, I don't have to be concerned at all about any of this stuff on the subject, because the mask of the folder tells Photoshop to not touch it, right? All right, so we've got to we've gone ahead and we have polarized this mask just a bit. I'm going to hold down Option or Alt again. I'm going to click back on this layer, and you can see now that we were successful in getting the brightening effect off of the flower petals, but I think I need to go one step further on the middles of these flowers. So for that, I'm going to make sure that I'm using my brush tool. I will confirm that I'm painting with black. I'm going to just make sure I'm on this brightness contrast mask, and then I'm just going to come in and make sure that all of these circles, all of the middles of these flowers are not being darkened and their contrast isn't being throttled as well. But I really don't have to worry about the edges or anything like that, and that's all because I did that selective color as my base adjustment. All right, so now we were able to really darken that background and make sure that that subject comes through in a really, really cool way. All right, so here's our before, and here is our after. Our before and our after, that is how you add pops of color, and that is how you select your subject and separate them from the background. We're now going to move on to our third example of how we can make colors pop in Photoshop. So now we're going to do our last edit. I'm going to go ahead and drag the last file that we have to work on and drop it into our Photoshop. But just so that you guys can see the before and after of what we are going to do, this is our before and this is our after. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that I want to do is I would like to duplicate the background layer. So we'll hit Command or Control plus J, and we'll call this Recolor. Now we're going to take this layer, we're going to go up to our filter menu. Let me just move this guy out of the way. That's the contextual taskbar. So we're going to go up to our filter menu, and we're going to choose Neural Filters. And now we have this awesome filter called Colorize. Now this is initially meant for black and white photos to colorize them, but one really cool tip is that you can use this to recolor an image that has kind of crazy color casts or stuff like that going on. You can also manually add a color. So you can click on a certain area and then you can add any color that you like into that area, and you can see how it shows up here in that area. But for this specific demonstration, I feel like the defaults did a really good job. So I'm going to take this color that I added and I'm just going to remove it, okay? Because nobody needs blue skin, right? So I'll go ahead and I'll export this. I'm totally fine with it exporting or outputting to the current layer because I duplicated the layer in my first step. So we'll go ahead and press OK. And that's going to be our first step. How easy was that? Hit Command or Control D to deselect my layer. Here is our initial beginner shot, and here is our after. So it looks a ton better. The next thing that I want to do is fix some of these areas. So I can see that there are a few areas that I would like to just touch up a little bit. Like the pink of her lips is bleeding out into the skin tone here. There's a little bit of yellow skin over here that I'd like to fix. And then the areas here around her eye, I would like to fix as well. So in order to do that, we are going to create a new layer, and we're going to call this Colorize. And we're going to actually change the blend mode of this colorized layer from normal to color. So we're going to go ahead and go down to color and make sure that that layer is set to a blend mode of color. Now, what's going to happen is anytime I paint with my brush stroke, it will be like painting with a highlighter of that certain color over an image. So all it's going to do is change the color. It will not change the texture at all. So we're going to hold down Option or Alt and sample the color closest to the lips that I would like to add this color back into the skin. And then I'll just go ahead and draw it in here. Now, probably for this example, having 100% opacity and 100% flow is is probably too high, but you could probably get away with it. But let's just be on the safer side. So I'm going to hit Command or Control Z twice. I am going to put my opacity, I'm going to change that to, let's say, 50% opacity. I'm going to sample in that same area where I sampled before and just kind of come over this skin area, sampling again, painting over. See how it's just doing the color and it is not changing the underlying pixels whatsoever. This is one of the beauties of working with a color blend mode. So if I come over here and I sample on the lips, we can add just a little bit more of that red saturation into the lips if we'd like. It's not going to affect brightness. It's not going to affect darkness. All it's going to do is it's going to take the color that you sample and place it over the color that you are painting over. So here we've got like a little bit of redness in the nose. I can go ahead and get rid of that just by painting with that colorizing effect. And then if we come up to the eye up here, let's sample this color here, holding down Option or Alt, and then just painting over that lash line just a bit. And let's pull a color from there and just recolorize that upper lid as well. I think that that's a little bit too far. Here's a helpful hint for any of the tools that you're using that are brush based. If you hold down Shift plus Command plus F, this is going to fade your most recent strokes. So why does my stroke say I'm already at 50%? That is because when I'm using my brush tool, I was painting at 50% opacity. But if I wanted to pull this last stroke down in terms of its visibility, I can do that by playing with the opacity. Now, just as a reminder, this is only going to affect the most recent stroke that you have painted with any brush tool, okay? So that's a really nice way of just really making something super custom so that you can fade a specific stroke if you feel like just that one was just a little bit too heavy-handed. I'm going to sample this color over here, and that's a little bit too saturated, so let's try up here. And we can get rid of that yellow tinge that I was seeing over that area. Okay, so I'm gonna just zoom out for a sec and let's see the difference that we made just by recolorizing some of the areas. So I think that that is a marked improvement on the different colorization areas. And again, from the beginning, huge improvement from the beginning. Colors are all over the place, right? Okay, so now we're going to move on to our next step, which is going to be tweaking this eye a little bit to make the colors match this eye. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to start with a levels adjustment layer. I'll come up here and I'm going to choose from my single adjustments in my adjustments window, we're going to choose levels. And then what I want to do is I want to make a selection over this area. So I'm going to just hit my lasso tool. Then I'm going to make a selection over that eye. L for lasso tool on your keyboard. I'm going to go ahead and invert this selection, Shift, Command or Control plus I to invert that selection, and then I'm going to invert this part of the mask by hitting Command or Control I, and then Command or Control D to deselect. So I'm going to hold down Option or Alt, I'm going to click on this mask and you can see the mask that I created there. It's just right over that eye. I do think that the edges of this are just slightly too harsh. So what I'd like to do is come into my feather slider here and pull the feather slider up until I see something where the edges are just blended enough that I don't really feel like I'm going to see any edges while I am making adjustments to this area on this levels layer that are not going to be visible anywhere else other than where this mask is white. Okay, so now that I have that set, I'm going to go into my levels properties. So within the properties window, I'm going to change from the masking properties of this layer to the actual properties of this layer. And then I'm going to go ahead and change these values here. So I'd like to bring my black point to about 9. And then I'd like to take my midtones and I want to brighten those up. So I'm going to brighten those up to 1.18. 1.20 is fine. and then 214 for the whites. So we're going to bring this in. That's good. That's good. So can you see how that was just brightened up just slightly? So that's looking good. I'm happy with that. The other thing that I just want to mention is that the levels not only works with your RGB values, but it also works for the specific colors themselves, reds, greens, and blues. So if I click on the blues, I can play around with how much blue is in my midtones, or how much of the complementary color of blue is in my midtones, aka yellow. All right, so if I needed to, this eye just seemed a little bit too blue overall. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the midtones of this eye and I'm going to shift them slightly so that there's a little bit less blue in that eye. So I hope that makes sense. We are removing blue from the midtones by adding yellow, adding the complementary color to that area. All right, let's go back to our RGB. Brighten it up just a touch and maybe add a little bit more of a black point and a little bit more of a white point. So there's our before and our after for the eye. I don't like that this brightening effect is being applied to the top lashes. So I'm going to go back to my layer mask and I'm going to hit my B for brush tool. I'll make sure that I am painting with black and I'm going to come in here at 100% opacity and just draw over that lid, just to confirm that none of that brightening effect is being applied to that upper lid. So that looks better. I'm happy with that. At this point, let's do some skin softening, some overall skin softening. At this point, let's go ahead and get rid of this crazy hair over on this side. I'm going to use my lasso tool. I'm going to activate my lasso tool by hitting the L key on the keyboard. I'm going to come around this hair here. I'm making sure that I am encompassing every single flyaway hair that I see. I'm going to come up to my contextual taskbar and I'm going to go ahead and put in a prompt. This is using generative fill. If you do not see your contextual taskbar for any reason, you can come into your window menu and you can make sure that contextual taskbar has a check mark next to it. That's what you want to make sure you have. I'll go ahead and come into the generate area here where you're able to put in a prompt, and I'm going to put in remove fly away hairs, and then I'm going to hit generate. You'll see now that within both my contextual taskbar and within the variations section of my properties window right here, you can see the three choices that we have to choose from for the fix. So if there's anything for any reason that you don't like, you can always hit generate again, and that's going to give you 3 new variations. 1, 2, 3. I think that's probably the best. Yeah, that looks good. All right, so I'm happy with that at this point. Now it's time to clean up the skin. I'm going to merge all of my visible layers that I have created so far. For that, I'm going to hold down Shift, Option, Command, plus E. For PC users, that is Shift, Alt, Control, E. Shift, Option, Command, E to merge visible layers, and we'll call this Skin. Now we're going to take this back into our neural filters, okay? So we'll take that layer, we're going to go to Filter, we're going to choose Neural Filters again. This time, instead of using our Colorize Neural Filter, we're going to use our Skin Smoothing Neural Filter. But I did want to just point out something to you. When you use all of these filters for the first time, you are going to be prompted to download these filters from the internet. So I've used skin smoothing before, but if for any reason your skin smoothing or your Colorize filter has this little icon next to it, you're not going to be able to use it until you download this from the cloud. Okay, so just a little bit of a note for beginner users. So I'm going to turn on my skin smoothing option here for my neural filters. Now there's some definite changes that need to be made. I personally feel like this filter is way too heavy-handed. So I'm going to take my blur slider and I'm going to pull it all the way down. And then what I'm going to do is I'll take my smoothness slider and take it up just a touch. Blur all the way down and smoothness up just a touch, just a little bit. And now that I've done that, I can go ahead and press OK. Remember that we can do an output of a current layer because we were able to merge visible before jumping into our neural filters for this filter. Okay, we'll go ahead and press OK. Bring our image back here, Command or Control D to deselect. So there is our skin softening. Again, I really feel like it's still too high. So what I'm going to do is pull down the opacity of this to about 74%. I think that that looks okay. All right, so now we've got some blemishes that need to be addressed. So this is a freckle. I'm not going to remove that, but we've got some blemishes down here that I would like to remove. So some of these larger blemishes are only darker than the skin that's around it. So what I'm going to do in this situation is I am going to use the healing brush tool, but I am going to use the healing brush tool on a certain blend mode. And whenever it comes to blend modes, those can be found right here in the tool. And you can see that I currently have this healing brush tool not set to normal, which is probably what yours is set to, but mine is set to lighten. And so because of that, I'm going to be able to just affect the pixels that are darker than where my sampling point is. And a good way for you to remember how these different blend modes work for this tool is to give yourself a sentence. I want to blank this blemish right here to make it blend in with the rest of the pixels. So if you said lighten, you were correct, right? Because we want to lighten those pixels to make them blend in with the surrounding pixels. Okay, so I'm going to hold down Option or Alt. I'm going to sample nearby, and then I'm going to go ahead and paint over those areas. But let me do the same thing again, but I'm going to sample in a dark area, and then I'm going to go over that area. Do you see how it didn't do anything? That's because your sampling place, where you sample the pixels from, needs to be brighter than the pixels that you're removing, okay? But the nice thing about using this brush is that you can be a little bit sloppier, and that's because you're only going to be removing the pixels that are darker than the area where you have sampled. Okay, so this is a cool, different, more advanced way to use this brush and this tool. So in the same vein, if we wanted to get rid of some of these tiny little white specks, what we could do is change our blend mode from lighten to darken. We're going to sample somewhere nearby that's a little bit darker than these little spots that we want to remove, right? So we're going to sample somewhere nearby, and I'm just going to go over those spots, and you'll see how it's only going to remove the areas where it's lighter than the surrounding skin. So this is a really cool way to look at a tool in a little bit of a different way, in a more advanced way, that's going to allow you to do less damage to the actual pixels that you are working on. Okay, so let's go back to lighten blend mode. Okay, so that looks good. I'm happy with that result. I still want it to feel very gritty because that's kind of what the overall image has. That's how it feels, if you will. The next thing that I want to do is just do an overall vibrance adjustment. So we'll go to our vibrance adjustment layer, and then in our properties window, we are simply just going to pull up the vibrance. Lastly, I would like to just darken this area over here on the left. So let's go ahead and use our lasso tool, L for lasso. We're going to make a selection around this area here. Then we're going to come to a hue saturation adjustment layer. Click on that. We'll call this darken background. Let's click on the mask of that and really feather the heck out of it with our feather slider. If you want to be able to see the feather that you're adding to this mask as you're adding it, hold down Option or Alt and click on the Darken Background Mask, and you'll be able to see that amount of feather that you're adding in your Properties window. Now you can hold down Option or Alt and click back on that mask icon to bring back the image. And then the only thing we're going to do here is change the blend mode of this darken background hue saturation adjustment layer from normal to multiply. And then maybe just take back this opacity a touch so it's not as dark. But I really wanted the first thing people see to be this face in the shot. So if we go ahead and preview our before image and our after image, you can see how we were able to really improve this image using some very advanced tools. Okay, folks, so I know that that was a really crazy in-depth tutorial about how to make colors pop in Photoshop. I hope you've enjoyed this and I hope you've learned something. I didn't expect it to be this long, but that's okay as long as you learn a thing or two. If you have learned anything or you've enjoyed this tutorial, go ahead and like and subscribe and make sure that you ring the bell for the next time that I come out with a video. And as always, I will see you on the next course.